Mhm. Welcome to the Emergence Podcast on evolving inquiry into the human mind and spirit. We explore what happens when art meets humanity and science meets quantum possibility. I'm Alice, joined by my co-host Mark, and in this episode, we revisit Carroll's Alice in Wonderland and interview Charlie Lovett, author of Lewis Carroll Formed by Faith, the first comprehensive study of how Carroll's sincere religious faith shaped his life and writing. Today, Mark will ask the first question. Welcome.
Welcome. I'm so happy to have you here. Your work is just so great and just wonderful. And that just wanted to tell you that before we just delve into this.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Believe me, it's our pleasure to have you. And our listeners are going to just, I hope that they get as much as we're going to get from it. So I'll just start off. In the 2022 University of Virginia Press interview, you were asked what it was that inspired you to write and publish the biography of Lewis Carroll, Formed by Faith. And you mused about being an Anglican and a heartfelt student of Lewis Carroll, who had long felt faith had been given a short shrift by previous biographers. Now, shrift is an archaic Christian term meaning priestly confession. Absolution being the ministerial act of forgiving and freeing the sinner's confession from mental guilt and blame, conferring moral release from obligations, penalties, and consequences so incurred for having acted wrongly or sinfully. So first, do you believe Christian confession and absolution are synchronic conceptions needing simultaneous resolution? And secondly, could you comment on Lewis Carroll's unorthodox choice to write and publish Alice in Wonderland rather than following his orthodox priestly lines of familial and generational descent, and so marking this decision as a sinful or wrongful act of duty needing shrift and absolution?
So I'll do my best on the first question, not being a theologian, but what I can say is that, confession and absolution are a part of the daily cycle of Anglican prayer that Lewis Carroll would have observed for his entire life. Having said that, a lot of times when people think about confession, they think about somebody walking into a small wooden closet and talking to a priest. And there was a movement at the time in the Anglican Church to sort of bring back individual priestly confession. And that was something that Lewis Carroll was not in favor of. He was, he felt like you didn't need a priest in between you and God, as far as I can tell from his writings. As far as the choice to write Alice in Wonderland, it began not as a choice to write a book. It began, as so many children's books do, as just simply entertainment for children that he was fond of. And they went on trips up and down the river in the summertime, and they said, "Oh, tell us a story," and he would tell them a story. I do the same thing with my grandson all the time. But the difference is, of course, I'm not Lewis Carroll. My stories aren't works of great genius, and but he was imposed upon by one of these young girls, Alice Little. She said, would you write that one down? She was the heroine of this particular story, and so she wanted him to write it down, and he took the challenge, and even then was writing a book for one individual child. And it wasn't until he got responses from friends that he showed the book to, in particularly George MacDonald and his family, that he made the decision to pursue publication. And even then, he made the decision to pursue publication under a pseudonym, not because he was trying to hide from friends or family or even acquaintances in Oxford. It was one of the most open secrets in Victorian England, who Lewis Carroll really was. But he did, I think, respect that separation between, his identity as a children's book author and then his more serious work as a mathematician, a logician, and whatnot. But even when he gets to writing Sylvie and Bruno later in life, he says, this is a book that mixes the grave and the gay. It's okay to mix these two things together, the entertainment of children and talking about more serious issues.
What brought you to explore Alice in Wonderland? I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but what was that aha moment that you particularly experienced where you just went down that rabbit hole?
So I came to Alice in Wonderland in two different ways. One, as a book collector. My father was a book collector. He collected a single title. He collected Robinson Crusoe.
Oh my God, I love that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating book to collect because it's been in print consistently for over 300 years now.
Yeah.
So I enjoyed helping him with that hobby and wanted to pursue it myself. And I thought Alice in Wonderland might be an interesting book to collect because I knew it had been illustrated by different people and translated into different languages. But I knew nothing about Lewis Carroll when I started. And also, I had grown up listening to these LP records of the British actor Cyril Richard reading Alice in Wonderland. So I came to it originally as Alice came to it, as an oral story told to me by an adult. True, it was an adult that wasn't in the room with me, but nonetheless, I didn't read it on the page until I was an adult. I only had, as a child, only heard it through those records. And every time I go back to it, I find new things and find new ways of looking at it. It's been a great lesson to me in context. As a scholar, I always sort of beat the drum of context because I've seen so many articles about Lewis Carroll where they took sort of one thing completely out of context and tried to draw conclusions from it. And with Alice, I think the fascinating context is having now gone back and read all the books that Lewis Carroll read as a child, and to see, it helps you see how radical Alice was at the time. That so much of what came before it was moralistic and didactic, and the adults were in control, and the child was just sort of a miniature adult that was having lessons crammed into his head. And here all of a sudden is a book where the child has agency and speaks truth to power and calls adults out on their nonsense, even to the point of standing up to royalty and calling them nothing but a pack of cards. I mean, that's pretty radical stuff in 1865.
Really good. I mean, I think that's the essence of the book. In my opinion, that's the essence of the book. It's all about, you know what? There's fun in life. And as a child, you're supposed to have fun. And that's been taken out of it. And that's the way I see it. Now, the question in my mind is, that had to be a very difficult decision for him. I mean, like, all of his duty and priestly lines said, you're going to follow this, right? You're going to be a priest or a theologian. You're going to take serious. This life is serious. This is not fun and games, right? And he went out on a limb and did this. This was something in his mind that he visualized that was, you have to visualize something that's different. Okay, so unless you can visualize something different, right? Nothing's gonna be imagined. Nothing's gonna come of it. So he must, in his mind, have imagined some other world that was very, very different than what was.
So I think, again, to talk about things in context, we have to understand that the whole idea of childhood is emerging and morphing at this time. I mean, the Corn Laws have pretty recently been passed. We're starting to question, maybe children shouldn't be working in factories for 12 hours a day. Maybe we should educate them. We're starting to build more and more schools for not just for the children of the wealthy, but I mean, Lewis Carroll's father was one of the people who built one of these schools. The church was building schools to educate all children, even children of the working class, which was a pretty radical shift. So this idea of childhood, this idea, like you said, of fun, of a time period in life when you can play games and have toys and just, have fun. That's kind of a new idea that he's helping to raise up. I mean, I think in some ways, I think of Lewis Carroll because he also invented all these games and things as one of the people who helped invent the notion of modern childhood. But also he does, even though he says very explicitly, Alice in Wonderland has no lessons, there is no religious moral to this book, he nonetheless uses the platform that he creates for himself to in writing Alice to become sort of an evangelist to children. I mean, he writes in the first edition of The Hunting of the Snark, he includes a little leaflet called An Easter Greeting to Every Child Who Loves Alice. And it's this little 2-page sort of Easter sermon for little children. And that eventually gets printed in the back of every copy of Alice in Wonderland. Same thing with his Christmas greeting. Same thing with the introduction to his facsimile of the original manuscript, Alice's Adventures in Underground. And then in Sylvie and Bruno, he has all these sort of little mini sermons. So he's not afraid to use his position as a famous children's author to, spread the good news of the gospel.
There is this undercurrent of seriousness that's going on in Alice in Wonderland. And it came to mind because yesterday I just watched again The Sound of Music, if you've ever seen that.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing. It's like on the surface, it's fun, it's music, it's love. And then underneath there are these currents of destruction, right? And they run straight through it. And whether or not you want to look at it as, the World War II in Nazi Germany, which it was, or you want to look at it as, the necessities of life that are put onto you. These seriousness just electrifies the novel, but it's really about fun and about love.
Yeah, I mean, the first joke about death in Alice in Wonderland comes just a few pages in when she says, I should think nothing about it if I fell off a house. And the author in parentheses says, which is very likely true, meaning if you fell off a house, you'd be dead, so you wouldn't think anything about it. And he talks about what does a candle look like after the flame has been blown out. There's all of these sort of musings on death. But again, to think about it in a broader context, because I think the darkness of Alice is definitely there and it's underneath. But the darkness in some of the children's books that he read as a child wasn't underneath. It was right on the surface. I mean, you look at a book like The Fairchild Family, there's a scene in that book where they're trying to teach the children a lesson. And in order to teach them this lesson, they take them out in the woods and show them this tree where a while back this convict was hung and the body is still hanging there, like being pecked by, I mean, it's just awful. And it's just in a children's book. So I think what's interesting is how that undercurrent of darkness, that toying with ideas about death is still there. But again, it's much more in a way where it's driven by the child and the child's mind. And how does a child begin to think about death? How does a child begin to think about some of these things, as opposed to an adult trying to beat the child over the head with these lessons of darkness that we see in the previous generation?
That's right. It's more like they say, for instance, if you have an autistic child, that you should let the child lead. And it's this idea that, we have all these preconceived notions of what, we need to teach children and what the lessons are. And this is just a different way of going about it.
Yeah. And I think Alice, especially in the first book, she realizes this gradually. She doesn't, at the beginning of the book, she really has no control at all. She's falling down a rabbit hole. She has almost zero control of herself and her environment. And by the end of the book, she has total control of herself and her environment, to the point that we discover that her environment has been created inside her mind this whole time. I remember as a child listening to those records and just thinking that was the greatest surprise ending ever, that she wakes up and the whole thing was a dream. And
right.
Lewis Carroll, he wrote a book called an adaptation called The Nursery Alice, which was, he said, written for children from 0 to 5. It was supposed to be, it wasn't really a board book, but it was color illustrations and the text was reduced greatly. And it always drove me crazy that book starts out with, I can't quote it exactly, but it basically says, once there was a little girl named Alice who had a very curious dream. And I thought, spoiler alert, because to me, that was the great twist at the end of the book that made me go back and look at the whole thing differently, to realize that this was all coming from her subconscious.
I think that the parallel is huge in The Wizard of Oz. It's just such a huge parallel. It all starts in black and white, and then at the end it's all color, and then in the end it goes back to black and white, and it's a dream.
In the film, not in the book of The Wizard of Oz, but in the film.
I didn't read the book. But I think that like what they're showing with this is that you can't really see anything without contrast.
Yeah.
You only see with contrast, right? If there's no blackness, there's no light. If there's no light comes out of the darkness. And
yeah, I mean, if there's if there's no death, then what does life mean? And he, Dodson writes I think very interestingly about death. He often uses this metaphor of death as waking from a dream. That our life on Earth is a dream, and then when it's over, we wake to the real life that comes after. And he hears this idea when he's 15 years old in a sermon at rugby school when he's at boarding school. One of the masters has passed away, and the headmaster gets up in the pulpit and literally says, "What is life? Is it just a dream?" And that comes back again and again in Lewis Carroll's work. We see it most famously in the poem at the end of Through the Looking Glass. Ever drifting down the stream, life, what is it but a dream? But we see it in the Easter greeting. He talks about that, and all these other places. And I think in some ways you can see Alice itself, the first book, even though it is coming much more from his subconscious, it's a much less planned book than Through the Looking Glass. Nonetheless, it begins with a fall and it ends with a resurrection. It is the story of mankind from the Christian viewpoint.
Yes, I totally agree. I think you cannot read really any novel without bringing in faith. You cannot read anything. There's no novel that you can read that way. I really believe that the Bible is the code for all literature, and all of the stories are reinvented one after another, but they have the same kind of structure, the same song, the same way of going about. And it's so striking in this. So I have to bring up another issue, and you can please tell me about this. We know that Carroll was a mathematician and a physicist, at his time. But at his time, there was no such thing as particle physics. In fact, there was no such thing as an atom, right? These things didn't come for another 50 years, okay? So he was imagining some sort of quantum world, right? I mean, the rabbit hole as, literally as a black hole, right? As a different world, right? And the entanglements, the quantum entanglements that he has in the novel, and the characters and their symbols, it's very hard not to interpret this with somebody who's a quantum physicist, right? Way ahead of his time.
I mean, I think to me, my knowledge of quantum physics is pretty limited. I took 2 weeks of quantum mechanics in a summer program in high school, and I think what it taught me and the professor is that you can't teach a high school student, no matter how precocious, quantum mechanics in 2 weeks. But I think that what you're saying does get something that I do understand about the novel, which is pretty remarkable, and that is that it is one of these novels that can be interpreted in so many different ways. And Dodson himself was aware of this, even though he says, "Hey, it didn't mean anything. It was just a story. It was just a lark." He knew that it came out of his own subconscious. He knew that there were people could interpret it in different ways. And he says, when he's talking about The Hunting of the Snark, which again is another brilliant piece of literature that can be interpreted in many ways, in a letter he says something along the lines of, "Well, when I wrote it, I didn't mean anything but nonsense. But still, our words can mean a great deal more than we intend for them to mean." And he basically is legitimizing the entire field of literary criticism. He's saying, look, if you're trying to say this is what I personally meant consciously as I was writing it, no, then you're wrong. I just meant nonsense. But if you're trying to say, here's what this text could mean, you go for it. I mean, he's giving people permission to say, this can mean to you whatever you want it to mean to you. And I think probably he isn't even fully aware of the extent to which his own subconscious is involved in weaving those multiple meanings. But over the generations, it's meant, I mean, in the 60s, it was like it was a drug thing. Oh, it's all about hallucinations and LSD. And then she became a feminist hero. And it was all in the 40s and 50s, it was all psychoanalytical, so Alice has been so many things to so many readers, I think it's sort of the perfect example of a book of the idea that writing a novel is only the first half of a creative act, and that act is not completed until somebody reads that novel, and each act of reading creates a different creative act. Even each act of reading for an individual reader creates a different creative experience.
He might go ahead, Alice. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious. Since you spent so much time revisiting the novel and studying it, is there and reading the articles, the mainstream articles, and even different perspectives about the book from other authors. Is there something that surprises you in recent times where you haven't thought about a concept before, or something in the book that hasn't been covered as much as you'd like for it to be covered?
I mean, I'm not a great reader of literary criticism. I am much more interested in biographical study. I think that's one of the things that led me to Formed by Faith, is because I felt like there was this hole in the biography. But then recently, a member of the Lewis Carroll Society, he was here in this room a couple of weeks ago, Ryan Armstrong, with this book about Alice in Wonderland and the Book of Job, which I haven't read yet, and I'm not sure if I'll understand it if I do read it, but I thought, how amazing that you can get a whole book out of that one idea, that one connection, So I think, I think there's one of the things that I really hope to do in my own scholarship, and I've already seen this start to happen with Formed by Faith, which is great, is I don't want what I write to be the last word on Lewis Carroll and religion. I want my work to be the first step that other people build on, and give other scholars the tools to write the things that I can't write, because I'm not a theologian and I'm not a literary critic. But I can say, look, here's the reality of his faith life. Here are the documents. Here is everything you need to know to then take the next step. So to me, that's what all scholarship should be. But I've always tried to be really focused on that in my own scholarship. That what I'm really trying to provide is tools for the next group of scholars to come and work with.
I think that's great. And I think you've obviously made a great start, because I think it all starts with faith. But faith, for many people, is not a continuous thing. It ebbs and flows, and you have times in your life when you really suffer and you question faith. And so faith becomes a trial of God, especially when you're doing bad times. And so it comes back to Carroll as a person. And I always look at this and I say, he must have been defiant in some way to have come up with this, because all of the press would be for him to go in one direction. And his mind would have had to have been so strong to hold on to itself in order to do this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pressure for him especially came from his father. Alice in Wonderland was published in 1865, and one thing we don't really know is how did his father react to this. His mother had been dead for many, many years, and his father died in 1868. So presumably his father saw the book, and his father, I think his father's vision for him was that he would follow in his father's footsteps. His father was a fairly important figure in the Anglican Church, the Victorian Church. He was a moderate high churchman, but he was also, wrote and published pretty widely, and was a well-known figure, and had set this example for his son about, here's what you do: you go and you get your degree, you teach for a little while, you get married, you get a parish, you work your way up the church hierarchy. And that did not interest the son. That he liked the university life. He wanted to stay there. And I think there's no doubt that caused tension between the father and the son. I mean, we have to intuit these things. We don't have documents that prove it one way or another, but I think it probably did. And I also think, and I sort of hint at this in the book, but when I'm writing a book, I want to try to stick as much as possible to facts and let the next group of people do the speculation, right? But I would speculate that after his father's death, he did have somewhat of a crisis of faith. It's at that point that he really fully and finally gives up the idea of ever becoming a priest and just staying a deacon. It's not long before that he gives up preaching, which comes back to later in life. But I think there is this dark time. He doesn't write in his diary for weeks on end after his father's death, partly because he's busy. His father, he's got to move the family. He's got many obligations to take care of. But I think it was a dark and difficult time for him. And at the same time, I think it was a time when he probably felt a weight lifted from his shoulders. That like, now you can be whoever you want to be. But he probably felt guilty for feeling happy about that weight lifted from his shoulders. So I'm sure, I think it was a very complicated time for him emotionally and spiritually.
Absolutely. And well said. And I see the same thing, though, over and over again in these people that write great novels or great pictures. I mean, I see this in Crime and Punishment in a big, very big way. And I see this in, again, I mentioned Wizard of Oz, Sound of Music. I see it in a very big way. Maria, what's the problem with Maria? Well, the problem is she's having too much fun. That's the problem.
Well, I think it's also, I think to me, one of the similarities between, I never really thought about Sound of Music and Alice, but I'm a fan of both pieces, is the idea of the search for identity. Alice is trying to figure out who she is. She, to the point it goes, am I Mabel? No, because her hair looks different from mine. Who in the world am I? That the caterpillar says, who are you? And she doesn't really have a good answer. And I think in the same way, Maria is trying to figure out her place in the world. Where does she belong? Who is she? Is she a nun? Is she something else? And that, of course, is a theme that comes back again and again and again in literature. It's a theme that I have played with a lot of my own novels, especially in Escaping Dreamland, which is a novel very much about the search for identity. But I think that's a big part of Alice, and some of that is the natural maturing of the child. That how do you discover your identity as a child? You begin to grow up. But I find it fascinating. This just occurred to me the other day. I don't know. I'd never thought about it before. I find it fascinating that Alice Little was 10 years old when they went on the famous river trip, and Lewis Carroll told them the story of Alice's adventures underground. But the child in the book is 7 years old. So even in the moment of telling that story on that beautiful day on the river with these three little girls, he's already nostalgic for the time when they were more childlike.
Right.
When they weren't preteens, they were, really little. And I find that fascinating because Alice is a book that has this nostalgia for childhood, but it never really occurred to me that, you see it so strongly in Through the Looking Glass in the scene where Alice is saying goodbye to the White Knight, who clearly symbolizes Lewis Carroll. And then, of course, in that beautiful final poem, which is a lament for lost childhood. But even on that very first day of creation, on that river trip, before it was a book, before it was a manuscript, it was I'm just telling a story. He's already kind of lamenting this loss of childhood.
Yes, but doesn't everybody want to stay there?
Yeah.
And as children, we want to be adults, and as adults, we want to be children. But we start as children, and we end our life childlike.
Yes, we do. That's very true.
Think about that.
It is.
Any other? I guess we have time for one more for the next 3 minutes. And do you have another question, Mark? Or
yeah, I got lots of questions.
One more, Mark. We got one more.
Oh, that's yeah. Okay, I'll talk about this. There's, when you talk about God, you talk about a unity of something that's hard to put together. Like you have the unity of opposites almost, a unity of duty and love together. Like as one symbol, you've got the dove, which is kind of a central archetype symbol in the Bible. It's an image of Christ because he became the promise of the dove, and it's of new beginnings, and it's of like God's deliverance and all this, and it's all together in one image, but it's of two parts, and that's the whole central part of like the quantum mechanics is this duality, is this dynamic thing that's never stopping, it's always oscillating, it never stays still. You can't unify it, you can't put it together. And so maybe you could comment on that sort of thing and how it relates to your view of Carroll.
Well, I mean, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about when you think about duality and unity, this is a story that's told in two books that are both wildly different from each other and very similar. I mean, it's often the two books are published together in a single volume, and people think, oh, it's all just one long continuous story. Often when we see it in film or on stage, the two books are intermixed. You have characters from Looking Glass and characters from Alice sort of, blending together. And yet, if you looked at them in their original form, there are great differences. You have the first book is very much, it's almost stream of consciousness. I mean, a significant chunk of it, more than half of it, was written as an oral story that was just off the cuff. And the people who were there in the moment say, hey, what's on the page? That's exactly what he said on the day. He's just writing down the same story that he told. So sure. It's definitely full of the subconscious and whereas Looking Glass is very carefully planned. It's structured after a chess game. It's written not while he's telling stories to little children, but as far as we know, it's written, in his rooms quietly over a period of several years. And we had a fascinating debate, sort of slightly comic, but slightly fun debate in the Lewis Carroll Society during COVID. We were trying to do things on Zoom, and we had a debate about which is the better book. I was the captain of Team Alice, and we won, by the way. But it was really interesting because it did sort of bring out the fact that in the sort of zeitgeist, people think of these as all kind of one book, and yet when you look at them carefully, they're radically different from each other, and yet the same. And so I think there's this fascinating duality with the pair of books that sort of have become one, and yet are not.
I think also it shows how real autobiography is. Like, I believe that whatever writing it is, it's autobiographical. And so the first part you can see as a flow state, it just comes out. And the second is editing. It's a conscious state. So you got the two, again, you got the dynamic there, right?
Yeah.
And this is why we have, one's from the heart, one's from the mind, subjective, objective. And would like to end here. We hope to have longer episodes because thank you.
Don't end yet.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Charlie. You are a wealth of knowledge, a pure treasure chest. And for those of you who would like to watch an earlier episode on Alice in Wonderland, where we decode Lewis Carroll's message to the world, which is still relevant, I'll drop the link in the description below. And I'll also drop some links to Charlie's wonderful books for you to explore. And as always, we end with what this Emergence podcast is about. It welcomes voices from across the fields, authors, scientists, preachers, doctors, educators, mediators, and so many others who offer new insights into what it means to evolve consciously and awaken to our entangled quantum world. So stay tuned. This is only the beginning. Thanks.